The desert sun beat down merciless and white, turning the afternoon into a furnace that baked the red buttes until they shimmered like mirages. Dust rose in slow, deliberate spirals around the corral, skating across earth so hard-packed it rang like iron under a boot heel. Nora Calder stood barefoot in that dust, feeling every sharp stone beneath her torn feet, her chemise hanging in tatters from shoulders burned raw by 6 weeks of sun and desperation. She was 24 years old, and she had stopped believing in mercy 3 days ago when they buried her grandmother in a shallow grave outside Red Bluff, with nothing but a wooden cross to mark the spot. The wooden cross had been crooked. Nora remembered that detail with painful clarity, how it leaned to the left, how the earth was too hard to dig deep enough, how Eliza had sobbed until she retched. Their grandmother had raised them after their parents died of typhoid, had scraped together every penny to send them west with promises of opportunity and fresh starts. Instead, they had found only dust disease and men like Josiah Grigg, who preyed on desperate women. Beside her now 19-year-old Eliza swayed on legs that barely held her weight, rope burns circling her wrists like brands. The younger sister's face was pale beneath the grime, her lips cracked and bleeding. Nora reached out instinctively, steadying Eliza with a hand on her elbow, and felt the tremor running through her sister's body, exhaustion, terror, or both. They had escaped Grigg's boarding house 2 nights ago, prying open a window with a stolen spoon, and running barefoot into the darkness, while Boone Lasker's drunken snores echoed through the hallway. They had run until their feet bled, until the town was a distant glow behind them, until they collapsed in a dry wash and slept fitfully beneath a sky so vast it made them feel smaller than insects. Nora's own hand pressed flat against her right thigh, fingers spread over the hem of her dress where 3 folded pages crackled with every shallow breath. Those pages were the only weapon she had left. Numbers, names, evidence written in her own careful script, memorized during long nights at Grigg's ledger desk, while Boone paced the hallway outside his boots, a constant threat. She had kept Grigg's books for 6 weeks, recording every fraudulent transaction, every wage stolen through scripted debt, every woman trapped by contracts that were little more than legalized slavery. And she had copied the most damning pages, hidden them, and waited for her chance to run. The warrior stepped from the shade of the painted lodge without sound, and Nora's heart kicked hard against her ribs. She had expected anger, or at least suspicion. Instead, she saw calculation in his dark eyes, the kind of careful assessment a hunter gives a wounded animal before deciding whether to put it down or let it live. He was not tall, perhaps 5'9", but he moved with the coiled efficiency of a man who had survived cavalry bullets and frontier winters. His hair hung in a single thick braid over his left shoulder, an eagle feather worked into the plait with sinew that had been stained deep red. Buckskin leggings, a faded cotton shirt, moccasins stitched with porcupine quills, and scars Nora's eye caught on the puckered line that ran from his left wrist to his elbow, too straight to be an animal wound. A saber cut, maybe, or something worse. But it was the other scar that made her breath catch. On the inside of his right forearm, barely visible beneath rolled sleeves, was a small brand, a crude letter G, burned into the skin. Fresh enough that the edges were still pink, the tissue raised and angry. Grigg's mark. Nora's mind spun. Had this man worked for Grigg? Was he still working for Grigg? She clutched Eliza's arm tighter, prepared to run, though she had no idea where. They had been following the river north for 2 days, drinking from it despite the gray scum that floated on the surface, eating wild onions and the few berries they could find. They were starving, exhausted, and hunted. And now they had stumbled into the camp of a man who bore Grigg's brand. The warrior's rifle, a Winchester repeater oiled to a dull gleam, hung loose in his right hand barrel, pointed at the ground. He studied them with the same methodical attention Nora had once given columns of numbers measuring every detail. The shaking in their hands, the raw marks at their wrists, the way Nora's eyes kept flicking toward the horizon behind them, where a thin column of rider's dust rose against the western sun. When Nora spoke, her voice came out steadier than she felt. "We need a place to sleep. Just one night. We can work for it. We're not beggars." She paused and then added with more force, "And we're not thieves no matter what Boone Lasker says." The warrior's gaze moved from her face to the horizon, then back to the pages hidden beneath her dress. One corner had worked free ink, smudged but legible. He saw it. She knew he saw it. His expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. When he spoke, his English carried the precise cadence of a man who had learned it as a second language and chose each word with deliberate care. "You will get more than a blanket." Behind him, horses snorted and stamped in the rope pen, a buckskin gelding, a paint mare, 3 others. Beyond them, the plateaus stacked themselves against the sky like the broken vertebrae of some ancient beast. A raven called from the rim of the arroyo, 3 harsh notes that echoed off stone and died in the heat. "My name is Kitchi." He said, his voice flat, revealing nothing. "You are running from the mine." It was not a question. Nora's throat tightened. "Yes." "From Boone Lasker." "Yes." "And you took something he wants back." Nora hesitated. In her peripheral vision, she saw Eliza's breath coming faster, heard the small panicked sound building in her sister's throat. The dust column on the horizon had grown thicker. They were maybe 20 minutes out, maybe less. Nora made a decision born of exhaustion and desperation, and the faint, irrational hope that this scarred stranger might understand what it meant to run from men like Grigg. She lifted her hand from her dress and held it out palm up. The gesture was neither surrender nor offering. It was a gamble. "I took proof. Proof of what Grigg does. What they all do." Kitchi's eyes narrowed, but not with anger. He was thinking, weighing risks and rewards, the way a gambler studies cards. The afternoon light caught the brand on his forearm again, and Nora could not help herself. "That mark. Grigg gave you that mark." Kitchi's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Yes." "Then you know what he's capable of. Better than most." His voice was cold, distant. "Which is why I know he will come for you. And when he does, he will not stop until you are dead or back in chains." Behind them, the sound of hooves on stone grew louder, distant still but closing. Kitchi glanced at the horizon one more time, then back at the sisters. Something shifted in his posture, a decision made. "Come inside." He turned and walked toward the lodge rifle held casual across his body. He did not look back to see if they followed. After a moment, Nora took Eliza's arm and guided her forward every step, sending jolts of pain through her torn feet. They stepped into the shade of the lodge, and the desert heat fell away like a discarded coat. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and sage and something green willow bark maybe, or sweetgrass braided and hung from the lodge poles. A fire pit occupied the center stones, arranged in a careful circle, coals glowing beneath a layer of ash. Blankets and buffalo robes lay folded along the western wall. A copper kettle hung from a tripod over the coals water, steaming faintly. The space was simple but meticulously organized, every item in its place, the mark of a man who had learned that survival depended on order. Kitchi set his rifle against a lodge pole and knelt by the fire without speaking. He poured water into 2 tin cups and handed the first to Eliza. She took it with both hands and drank without pause, water spilling down her chin and onto her torn dress. Nora accepted the second cup more slowly, watching Kitchi over the rim as she drank. The water was lukewarm and tasted faintly of metal, but it was the best thing she had tasted in days. Kitchi sat back on his heels and studied them with the same methodical attention he had given them outside. His gaze lingered on Nora's wrists, on Eliza's blistered feet, on the corner of the page still visible beneath Nora's hem. Finally, he spoke. "Where did you come from?" "Pennsylvania," Nora said. Her voice was hoarse from thirst and dust. "We came west with our grandmother. She died 2 days ago just outside Red Bluff. Fever took her in the night." Kitchy's expression did not change. "And then, we had no money for passage home. A man at the freight office, a teamster named Dill, told us there was work at Griggs' boarding house. He said it was respectable work. Cooking, cleaning, mending. He said we would have a room and 3 meals a day." Nora's voice flattened. "He lied." "They always do." Kitchy reached for a leather pouch beside the fire pit and pulled out strips of dried meat venison by the smell seasoned with juniper and salt. He handed them to the women without ceremony. Eliza ate immediately, tearing at the tough fibers with her teeth. Nora held hers but did not eat. She was still watching Kitchy, trying to read the man behind the scars. "What do you want from us?" she asked quietly. Kitchy tilted his head slightly, a gesture that might have been amusement or acknowledgement. "I want to know who is following you. I want to know what weapons they carry. I want to know if they will stop at talking or if they will come with fire." Nora swallowed. "Boone Lasker. He rides a bay gelding with a split left ear. He carries a cut-down Spencer rifle and a Colt revolver. He will not stop at talking. He will kill us if he catches us." "How many men with him?" 2, maybe 3. Miners. They do whatever Boone tells them." Kitchy nodded slowly. He stood and walked to the lodge entrance, pulling aside the hide flap to look east. The dust column had grown closer, less than 2 miles now. He let the flap fall and turned back to the women. His face was unreadable, but Nora saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand instinctively moved toward his knife. "He will find you by morning," Kitchy said quietly. "Maybe sooner." Eliza made a small sound, half sob, half gasp. Nora put a hand on her sister's shoulder and squeezed hard. "Then we'll leave now. We won't bring trouble to you." "You already brought it." Kitchy's voice was matter-of-fact, no accusation in it. "But I do not send women into the desert without water or weapons. Rest by the fire. At dusk, I will move you." "Move us where?" "Away from here. Away from him." Kitchy's gaze shifted to the hem of Nora's dress, where the corner of the ledger page still showed. "And you will tell me what is written on those papers." Nora's hand moved instinctively to cover the pages, but Kitchy shook his head. "Not here." He said, his voice quiet but firm. He stepped closer, close enough that Nora could smell sweat and smoke and leather on him, and placed his hand over hers, pressing the fabric down to hide the ink. The touch was brief, practical, but Nora felt the calluses on his palm, the warmth of his skin through the thin cotton. And something else, a faint tremor, as if the act of touching her cost him something. He pulled his hand back and stepped away. "When we are safe, then you will show me." Nora nodded, her throat tight. Kitchy returned to the fire and added another stick to the coals. The smoke thickened, curling upward through the smoke hole. Outside, the horses stirred restlessly in their pen. A hawk screamed somewhere high above the plateaus, hunting in the last good light of the afternoon. Nora sat beside Eliza and forced herself to eat the venison slowly, chewing each bite until it was soft enough to swallow. The meat was tough, but clean. No hint of rot or mold. She watched Kitchy move around the lodge, checking rifles, filling water skins made from buffalo bladders, rolling blankets into tight bundles secured with rawhide straps. His movements were efficient, economical, no wasted motion. She noticed the brand on his forearm again and wondered what it meant. Had Grigg marked him like livestock? Had he worked in the mine, escaped? And if he had escaped, why had he stayed so close? Kitchi caught her looking and held her gaze for a long moment. His eyes were dark, unreadable. But there was something in them, grief maybe, or rage held so tightly it had turned to ice. Then he knelt beside Eliza and gestured to her feet. "Let me see." Eliza hesitated, then extended her legs. Her feet were blistered and raw, the soles torn open by miles of barefoot running over stone and thorn bush. Blood had dried in dark crusts around the wounds. Kitchi examined them without touching, then reached for a small clay pot beside the fire. He opened it bear grease, mixed with something sharp and medicinal yarrow root, maybe, and began to apply it to Eliza's wounds with careful fingers. She flinched, but did not pull away. Nora watched the tenderness in his movements, the way he kept his touch light and deliberate, and felt something loosen in her chest. This man, whoever he was not like Boone. He was not like Grigg. He handled pain the way a healer would, not a jailer. When he finished with Eliza's feet, he tore strips from a clean cloth and wrapped them, tying the bandages with knots that would hold but not cut off blood. He sat back and looked at Nora. "Your turn." "I'm fine." "You are not." He gestured to her wrists, where the rope burns glowed angry red, the skin split and weeping. "Show me." Nora extended her arms. Kitchi took her left wrist in his hand and turned it, gently examining the damage. His thumb brushed the edge of the burn, testing for heat and infection. Nora's breath caught not from pain, but from the unexpected intimacy of the gesture. No one had touched her with care since her grandmother died. No one had looked at her wounds and tried to heal them. Kitchi applied the salve and wrapped her wrists as he had Eliza's feet, then released her and stood. "Rest now. We leave when the sun touches the plateau." Nora lay back against a folded buffalo robe, Eliza curled beside her. The firelight played across the lodge walls, shadows shifting like living things. She closed her eyes and tried to slow her breathing, but her mind would not quiet. She thought of the boarding house, the locked doors, the ledger Boone had forced her to keep, wage theft disguised as businessmen and women, trapped by contracts that were little more than chains. She thought of the pages hidden in her dress, the numbers and names that could break Grigg if anyone cared enough to look. She thought of Kitchi's hand over hers, the weight of it, the certainty. And she thought of the brand on his forearm, that crude letter G burned into his skin. What had Grigg done to him? Outside, the sun touched the rim of the western plateau. The light turned from gold to red to deep violet. The horses stamped and blew. A coyote began to sing somewhere in the arroyos, and another answered from the east, their voices rising and falling in eerie harmonies. Kitchi stood at the lodge entrance, rifle in hand, watching the dust rise in the failing light. He thought of his younger brother Wombly, who had vanished 6 months ago near the silver mine. He thought of the brand on his own arm, the 2 weeks he had spent shackled in Grigg's mine shaft before he killed the guard and escaped. He thought of the promises the white men made and the treaties they burned. He thought of the 2 women sleeping by his fire, their wrists bound by men who believed ownership was a right. He did not trust them yet, but he understood them, and that for now was enough. The dust drew closer. Kitchi checked the load in his rifle and waited for the night to fall. The story of Red Bluff began as so many stories in the West did with silver. In 1873, a prospector named Josiah Grigg struck a vein of ore so rich it glittered like starlight in the lamplight. Within 6 months, he had staked his claim, built a stamp mill, and hired 60 men to work 3 shifts around the clock. The town that grew up around Grigg's silver Sire, mine was not a town in any civilized sense. It was a scar on the land, a collection of pine-board shacks and canvas tents, clustered around the mouth of the mine like flies on a carcass. The mine burrowed into the base of a red sandstone cliff, its entrance framed by timber beams, black with soot and decades of smoke. Ore carts rattled day and night along iron rails, hauling rock to the stamp mill where it was crushed into powder and washed with mercury. The tailings gray sludge, thick with poison, ran down a wooden sluice and into the river that fed the cottonwood bottoms 2 miles south. The Lakota families had lived along that river for generations, beyond counting. They fished the eddies where the current slowed, trapped beaver in the willows, dug camas root from the wet meadows in spring, and hunted deer in the pine forests that climbed the foothills. The river was written into treaties signed in Washington, treaties that promised fishing rights and clean water in perpetuity. But treaties like promises had a way of turning to dust when silver was involved. Kitchie had watched the mine grow from a single shaft to a sprawling operation that employed 60 men and ran 3 shifts. He had watched the river turn gray, the fish go belly up in the shallows, the beaver vanish as the poison seeped into their lodges. He had watched white men come and go, some decent enough, most not. And he had watched his people try to hold on to what little remained, their voices growing smaller with each passing year. His lodge stood a 1/4 mile from the river on high ground above the floodplain where the cottonwoods grew thick. It was a good spot, defensible, with a clear view east and west, sheltered from the worst of the winter winds by a low ridge. He had built it himself 4 years ago after the cavalry skirmish that left him with a bullet scar across his ribs and a hatred of soldiers that would never fully heal. He was 34 years old. Lean and hard, his face carved by wind and sun into something severe. He worked as a scout and interpreter for Dr. Maeve Hollis, a red-haired Irish woman who ran a clinic out of a log cabin 3 miles north of Red Bluff. Maeve treated miners and Lakota families alike, charged what people could pay, coin pelts, labor, whatever they had, and asked no questions about the past. Kitchie traded her venison and rabbit for quinine and bandages. It was a fair exchange, and one of the few he trusted in this world. He did not trust much else, especially not the mine. 6 months ago, his younger brother Wombly had ridden east to check trap lines near the river and never returned. Kitchie had searched for weeks, followed tracks to the mine road, found boot prints and horse droppings, but no body, no blood, no sign of struggle. The miners he questioned shrugged and said they had seen nothing. Boone Lasker, Grig's foreman, had smiled that thin, mean smile of his and told Kitchie to stop asking questions or he would get answers he did not like. Kitchie had not stopped asking. He had simply stopped asking out loud. 2 weeks later, he had been caught near the mine entrance at dusk, scouting the slag pile for any trace of his brother. Boone and 3 miners had jumped him, beaten him unconscious, and dragged him into the mine. When Kitchie woke, he was shackled to a post in the number 2 shaft, his right forearm held down, while Grig himself pressed a red-hot branding iron into his skin. The smell of burning flesh had filled the tunnel. Kitchie had not screamed. He had bitten through his own lip to keep from giving Grig the satisfaction. "You want to know what happened to your brother?" Grig had whispered, his breath reeking of whiskey and tooth rot. "He's in the ground, just like you'll be if you don't learn your place." Not Greerhoek. Kitchie had spent 2 weeks in that shaft, forced to swing a pickaxe 12 hours a day, eating moldy bread and drinking water that tasted of copper and sulfur. On the 15th day, he had killed the guard with a stolen rock hammer and escaped through an old ventilation shaft. He had crawled 3 miles through the desert, bleeding and half dead, until Maeve found him and stitched him back together. But he had never forgotten Grig's words. Wombly was dead. Kitchie knew it in his bones, and he knew Grig had killed him or ordered him killed and buried the evidence in the slag pile like so much waste rock. As the sun dropped below the plateau rim, Kitchi woke the women and began to pack. He moved quickly, but without panic, rolling blankets, filling water skins, checking hobbles and saddle girths. Nora and Eliza stood by the fire, still groggy with exhaustion, and watched him work. Nora's eyes kept drifting to the brand on his arm, questions forming behind her gaze. Kitchi caught her looking. "You want to know about this?" He held up his forearm, letting the firelight catch the scar. Nora hesitated, then nodded. "Grigg gave it to me," Kitchi said quietly. 2 weeks in his mind, shackled like an animal. He thought it would break me. It did not. Nora's eyes widened. "You escaped?" "Yes." "Then you know what he's capable of." "Better than most." Kitchi's voice was flat, emotionless. "Which is why I know he will come for you. And when he does, he will not stop until you are dead or back in chains." He paused, then added, "Like the water that wears away stone, he does not give up. He simply keeps pushing until there is nothing left." Eliza made a small, frightened sound. Nora's jaw tightened. "Then we run." "Running is not enough. He has men, horses, money. He will find you." Kitchi finished tying the last bundle and turned to face them. "Unless you give me something I can use against him." Nora pulled the folded pages from her dress and handed them to Kitchi without a word. He angled them to catch the firelight and read slowly, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the words. The first page was a payroll roster, names and wages listed in neat columns. Most of the wages were marked paid in scrip, redeemable at company store only. The second page was a freight bill for mercury dynamite and timber. The third page was a labor contract signed by Nora Calder and witnessed by Grigg himself. The language was dense, full of legal terms Kitchi only half understood, but the intent was clear. Nora owed room, board, and clothing fees that exceeded any wages she might earn. She was bound to the boarding house for a minimum of 1 year. Refusal to work or attempts to leave would result in arrest for theft of company property. Kitchi's jaw tightened as he read. When he finished, he folded the papers and handed them back. "This is not a contract. This is slavery with better words." "I know." Nora's voice was flat, drained of emotion. "Eliza and I were locked in at night. Boone kept the keys. He said if we tried to run, he would have us arrested. He said no judge would take our word over Grigg's. He said we were like numbers in a ledger, assets to be managed, not people." Kitchi nodded slowly. "He is probably right. The law here is bought and paid for." "Then what do we do?" "We find proof that cannot be ignored. Proof written in blood and bone." Kitchi crossed to his pack and pulled out a worn leather map, spreading it on the ground. He pointed to a spot marked in charcoal. "There is a woman, Dr. Hollis. She keeps records. She has treated men from the mine, women from the boarding house. If there are others like you, others Grigg has trapped, she will know. And if we can gather enough evidence, we can take it to someone outside Red Bluff. Someone who will listen." "Who?" Nora asked. "The territorial marshal. 2 counties over. He is honest, or as honest as any man with a badge." Kitchi's gaze shifted to Nora's face, measuring her resolve. "But first, we need more than these 3 pages. We need the main ledger, the one Grigg keeps in his safe." Nora's breath caught. "You want us to rob him?" "I want to take back what he stole." Kitchi's voice was hard, final. "From you, from my brother, from everyone he is buried in that slag pile." He did not explain further. But Nora saw the grief and rage warring in his eyes, saw the way his hand clenched involuntarily when he mentioned his brother. She understood then that this was not just about justice. It was personal. She glanced at Eliza, who nodded faintly, then looked back at Kitchi. If we do this, we do it together. And you tell us everything. No more secrets. Kitchi held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. No more secrets. They rode through the night, following the river north, where the willows grew thick and the water ran cold and shallow. The horses moved through the current, and their hooves splashing softly moonlight, turning the ripples to silver. Kitchi led the way on the buckskin gelding, Nora seated behind him, with her arms locked around his waist, feeling every shift of his body as he guided the horse through the treacherous footing. She could feel his heartbeat through his shirt, steady and strong, and the warmth of his body against the cold night air. Behind them, Eliza rode the paint mare, swaying dangerously. Kitchi had tied a rawhide strap from her belt, to his saddle horn a lifeline that kept her from sliding off when exhaustion dragged her toward unconsciousness. They did not speak. The night was filled with sound coyotes, howling from the bluffs, the soft hoot of an owl hunting from a cottonwood branch, and the distant rumble of the stamp mill grinding ore into powder. Upstream, a sluice gate opened with a metallic shriek, dumping fresh tailings into the river. The water turned briefly gray, thick with poison before the current swept it south. Nora pressed her face against Kitchi's back, smelling sweat and smoke and leather, and tried not to think about how close they were to the mine, how close Boone and his men might be. They reached Dr. Hollis's cabin just after midnight, and the windows glowing with lamplight behind calico curtains. Maeve met them at the door before they could knock her red hair loose around her shoulders, a revolver in her hand. She took one look at their faces, Kitchi's split knuckles, Nora's haunted eyes, Eliza barely conscious in the saddle, and stepped aside without a word. Inside, quickly. They stumbled into the cabin. Maeve lit another lamp and gestured to a bench near the stove. Eliza collapsed onto it, and Maeve knelt, immediately unwrapping the bandages on her feet. The wounds had reopened during the ride, fresh blood soaking through the cloth. Maeve worked quickly, cleaning and stitching with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Eliza whimpered, but did not pull away. Kitchi stood by the door, rifle in hand, watching the road through the window. Nora crossed to Maeve's side and asked quietly, "Can I help?" "Hold her hand," Maeve said without looking up. "Talk to her. Keep her focused on something other than the pain." Nora took Eliza's hand and squeezed. "Remember when we were little? Remember the creek behind Grandma's house? You used to catch tadpoles in a tin bucket and name every one of them." Eliza nodded faintly, tears streaming down her cheeks. Nora kept talking, weaving memories like a blanket, trying to wrap her sister in something soft and safe. Maeve finished the stitches, applied salve, and wrapped Eliza's feet in clean bandages. Then she stood and crossed to Kitchi, examining the burn on his shoulder, where the lodge fire had singed him earlier. "Take off your shirt," she ordered. Kitchi hesitated, then complied. Nora saw the full extent of his scars. For the first time, the puckered saber cut on his left arm, the bullet scar across his ribs, the brand on his right forearm, and others, a whip mark across his back, burns on his hands from working forge fires, old knife wounds that had healed poorly. He was a map of violence, every scar a story written in pain. Maeve cleaned the fresh burn and applied a poultice of comfrey and honey. "You are lucky. Another inch and you would have lost the use of your arm." She glanced at Nora. "Now, show me the papers." Nora pulled the pages from her dress and handed them over. Maeve read by lamplight, her expression darkening with each line. When she reached the labor contract, she swore a low, bitter sound that carried the weight of years. "This is not legal, not in any court that matters. Boone says no judge will listen to us," Nora said quietly. "Boone is a liar." Maeve set the papers on the table and crossed to a wooden filing cabinet in the corner. She opened the top drawer and pulled out a leather-bound ledger of her own. She flipped through the pages, then tapped one entry with her finger. 3 months ago, a woman came to me with burns on her hands and arms. Kitchen burns, she said. She was terrified. Wouldn't give her name. But she kept talking about the empty lot by the river, the one where the old trading post used to stand. She said she used to walk there when she needed to think. She said it was the safest place she knew because nobody paid attention to empty ground. Maeve's voice tightened. I treated her and gave her supplies. 2 weeks later, I heard she had been found by the river. Drowned, they said. Nora's breath caught. Drowned. That is what Sheriff Lyle claimed, but her hands were still bandaged when they pulled her out. She could not have swum. Maeve's voice was tight with suppressed rage. Grigg is not just trapping women. He is killing them and burying the evidence. The cabin went silent. Outside, a branch scraped against the window. Kitchie turned from his post, his face unreadable. Do you have proof? I have my notes. I have testimony from miners who say Grigg uses contract labor men and women and disposes of the ones who cause trouble. But no one will testify in court. They are too afraid of losing their jobs, or worse. Then we make them less afraid. Kitchie's voice was flat final. We take the main ledger from Grigg's office. We find the contracts, the pay records, the names of everyone he has hurt. And we take it to someone who cannot ignore it. Maeve shook her head. You are talking about breaking into the boarding house in the middle of Red Bluff. Grigg keeps it locked like a fortress. Boone sleeps on the first floor, and after tonight, they will be expecting you. I know. Kitchie crossed to the table and pulled the folded papers from Nora's hand. He spread them flat and pointed to the payroll roster. This is a start, but it is not enough. We need the safe, the documents inside, everything Grigg has hidden. Nora stared at him. How do we even get inside? The same way you got out, through a window or a back door, or we walk in like we belong there. Kitchie looked at Maeve. You said there were men and women. Did any of them have a Lakota name? Maeve hesitated, then returned to the filing cabinet. She pulled out a single yellowed receipt and handed it to Kitchie. It was signed by the teamster Dill, the same man who had lured the Calder sisters to Red Bluff and dated 6 months prior. The text was brief, received one native laborer, W. Eagle. No pay. Held for damages to company property. Transfer to number 2 shaft. J. Grigg Kitchie's hands shook as he read. The paper crumpled slightly in his grip. He stared at the words for a long time, his jaw working, his breathing shallow and uneven. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Wombly. I am sorry, Maeve said quietly. I did not know he was your brother. The teamster gave it to me as payment for stitches. I kept it because it felt wrong. But I did not know. Kitchie did not respond. He stood rigid, staring at the receipt, and Nora saw the grief and rage warring in his eyes. She understood then the full weight of what drove him. This was not about justice. It was about vengeance. It was about finding the brother who had been stolen from him and making the men responsible pay in blood. We go tomorrow, Kitchie said finally, at dawn, before they expect us. The town of Red Bluff stirred to life as the sun rose, painting the pine-board buildings in shades of gold and amber. Miners trudged toward the stamp mill, their faces gray with exhaustion, their boots ringing on the hard-packed street. Women hung laundry on lines stretched between buildings. Children chased chickens through the alleys. It looked, Nora thought, almost normal, almost peaceful. But she knew the rot beneath. They entered Red Bluff just after dawn, disguised as best they could manage. Kitchy had traded his eagle feather and buckskin for a plain cotton shirt and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. Nora wore one of Maeve's clean dresses, her hair pinned up beneath a bonnet. Eliza sat in the back of Maeve's mule cart, hidden beneath a tarp, her feet still too damaged to walk. Maeve drove looking every inch the respectable frontier doctor making her morning rounds. They passed the assay office, the livery, the general store. At the schoolhouse, a woman stood on the porch ringing a bell to call the children inside. She was tall and thin, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. Ruth Caldwell, the schoolteacher. Maeve had spoken of her a fair-minded woman who had once testified against a minor for beating his wife, an act that had earned her both respect and enmity in equal measure. Ruth's eyes followed them as they passed, lingering on Nora's bruised wrists and Kitchy's scarred face. She nodded once slowly, a gesture of acknowledgement, or perhaps warning. They stopped at the boarding house. It was a 2-story structure with a false front and a heavy lock on the main door. The windows on the second floor were barred. Nora felt her stomach twist as memories flooded back the locked door. Boone's footsteps in the hall, the sound of women crying in the rooms next to hers. Maeve handed Nora a canvas sack. "Act normal. You are delivering supplies. If anyone asks, you work for me now." Nora nodded, her throat tight. Kitchy fell into step beside her, his hand resting casually on the knife at his belt. They entered through the back door, the one that led to the kitchen. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of grease and old coffee. A woman stood at the stove, stirring a pot of beans. She glanced up, startled, then relaxed when she saw Nora's dress. "Delivery?" the cook asked. "Yes, ma'am." Nora said, her voice steady. "Bandages and medicines from Dr. Hollis." The cook nodded and turned back to her pot. "Second floor, end of the hall, Griggs' office, knock first." Nora and Kitchy climbed the narrow back staircase, moving slowly to avoid creaking boards. At the top, a hallway stretched left and right. 3 doors on the left, 2 on the right. The last door on the right was reinforced with iron straps, just as Maeve had described. Kitchy tested the handle locked. He pulled a thin piece of wire from his belt, the kind used for snares, and worked it into the keyhole. His hands were steady, his breathing slow and controlled. After 30 seconds, the lock clicked. He pushed the door open. The office was small and cluttered with papers and ledgers stacked haphazardly on a battered desk. A lamp sat beside an inkwell, its wick trimmed short. In the corner, bolted to the floor, was the safe. It was a heavy iron box with a 2-tumbler lock painted black and marked with the manufacturer's name, Herring & Co. New York. Nora crossed to it and knelt. I watched Boone open it twice. I counted the rotations, the direction. I memorized the sequence because I knew one day I might need it. Kitchy stood by the door, watching the hallway. How long? 2 minutes, maybe 3. Nora placed her ear against the safe and began to turn the dial, listening for the faint click of tumblers falling into place. Her hands shook. Sweat beaded on her forehead. She turned the dial left 3 full rotations, and then right 2.5 adjusted, tried again. Click. The first tumbler fell. She exhaled slowly and turned the dial the other direction, counting rotations in her head. Click. The second tumbler fell. She gripped the handle and pulled. The door swung open with a soft groan of hinges. Inside the safe was stuffed with documents, contracts bound with string receipts, yellowed with age deeds for property in Red Bluff, and beyond tax records that did not match the dates on the contracts. Nora pulled out the main ledger, a heavy leather-bound book with Griggs' name embossed on the cover in gold leaf. She flipped it open and scanned the entries. Payroll, scrip payments, fees for room board, clothing tools, labor contracts, and then near the back, a list of names marked with black X's. Beside each name, a single word buried. Nora's breath caught. There were dozens of names. men and women. Some she recognized from the boarding house. Others were unfamiliar. At the bottom of the list, written in fresh ink, W. Eagle. Number 2 shaft. Cave-in. Disposed. Beneath Wombley's name was a notation in the margin, written in a different hand, Sea Freight Bill 18730412. Silver shipment. Government contract. Priority disposal. Labor cost 0. Nora showed the page to Kitchie. His face went rigid, the color draining from his skin. He reached into the safe and pulled out a beaded knife sheath, worn and faded with age. He turned it over, tracing the pattern with his thumb, an eagle in flight, worked in blue and white beads. Lakota craftsmanship. His mother's work. Wombley's, he whispered. His voice cracked on the name. He closed his fist around the sheath and looked at Nora, his eyes wet. He was here, in this room, and Grigg took everything from him. Nora stuffed the ledger and as many documents as she could carry into the canvas sack. Kitchie slipped the knife sheath into his shirt next to the receipt Maeve had given him. They were turning to leave when footsteps thundered up the main staircase. "Blast!" Kitchie hissed. He shoved Nora toward the window. "Go, now!" Nora threw the sack out the window. It hit the mud below with a soft thud. She climbed onto the sill, her heart hammering, and looked down. 6 feet. She could do it. She jumped. The landing drove the air from her lungs. She rolled gasping and grabbed the sack. Above her, the office door burst open. She heard Boone's voice raw with rage. "You!" A gunshot. Wood splintered above Nora's head. She screamed. Kitchie appeared in the window, vaulted through, and landed beside her. He grabbed her arm and hauled her to her feet. They ran. Behind them, Boone leaned out the window, his ruined hand cradled against his chest, his face twisted with fury. He fired again with his left hand, the bullet wild. It struck a post near Nora's head, sending splinters flying. 2 miners appeared at the corner of the building, rifles raised. Kitchie and Nora sprinted toward the alley. A bullet kicked up dirt at Nora's heels. Her lungs burned. Her legs screamed. Kitchie pulled her around the corner out of the line of fire, and they kept running. They ran straight into Deputy Ethan Pike. He stood in the middle of the alley, his rifle leveled, his badge glinting in the morning sun. For a moment, Nora thought he would arrest them, but instead, Ethan stepped aside and gestured sharply toward the river. "Go, the ford. I will hold them here." "They will kill you," Kitchie said. "Maybe, but you do not have time to argue." Ethan's voice was steady calm. 3 years ago, you pulled me out of the Willow Creek ford when my horse went down. I would have drowned. I owe you my life. Now go." Kitchie hesitated and then nodded. He and Nora sprinted toward the river. Behind them, Boone and the miners rounded the corner. Ethan blocked the alley, rifle raised. "Store your irons, Boone. This is over." Boone spat blood. "Move, Pike, or I will move you." "You will try." Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. "But you will not like how it ends." At that moment, the school bell began to ring, loud, insistent, over and over. Ruth Caldwell stood on the schoolhouse porch, both hands on the bell rope, her face set with determination. Townspeople emerged from buildings drawn by the noise. Miners, shopkeepers, families. They filled the street, murmuring, watching. Boone hesitated, his eyes flicking from Ethan to the crowd. He lowered his rifle. "This is not over," he snarled. "Yes, it is," Ethan said quietly. "You just do not know it yet." Kitchie and Nora reached the ford, where Maeve waited with the mule cart. Eliza was already in the back, pale and frightened. Kitchie secured the canvas sack in oilskin and tied it to his saddle. He pulled Nora onto the buckskin behind him, her arms locking around his ribs. "Hold tight," he said. The buckskin plunged into the river. The spring melt had swollen the current, turning the water fast and deep. The horse struggled its hooves, slipping on the rocky bottom. Midstream, a floating log struck Kitchy's shin with brutal force. Pain flared white-hot. He grunted, nearly fell. The buckskin reared, panicking. Nora's arms tightened around him, her body pressed hard against his back. She felt his muscles tense, felt the shudder of pain that ran through him. "Lean," he shouted. They leaned together, instinct and desperation, shifting their weight as one. The horse found its footing, surging forward. Kitchy dug his heels in and drove the buckskin up the far bank. Behind them, Eliza's paint followed Maeve, guiding it with steady hands. On the opposite bank, 3 riders appeared through the willows. Boone and 2 miners. They reined in at the water's edge, staring across the swollen river. Boone raised his rifle with his good hand, aiming at Nora. Kitchy spun the buckskin, raised his Winchester, and fired in one fluid motion. The bullet struck one of the miners in the shoulder. He screamed and tumbled into the current, his horse bolting. The wounded man flailed, went under, resurfaced briefly, then disappeared downstream. The other miner grabbed for him, but missed. The current swept him away, his screams fading into the roar of the water. Boone lowered his rifle, his face a mask of impotent rage. Kitchy held his gaze for a long moment, then turned the buckskin north. They rode hard, the river flashing beside them, the sun climbing higher. They did not stop until Red Bluff was a smudge on the southern horizon. Kitchy dismounted, limping heavily, and checked the buckskin's legs. His shin throbbed, already swelling. He could feel bone grinding against bruised tissue. He looked at Nora. "You held on." "I had to." She met his eyes, and something unspoken passed between them, gratitude, respect, and something deeper. "You would have fallen. And I." She paused, searching for words. "I could not lose you. Not after everything." Kitchy's hand found hers, their fingers tangling briefly. Neither spoke. They did not need to. The bond between them, forged in fire and blood and desperation, was already stronger than words. They returned to the hidden Lakota camp in the canyon, where Kitchy's Aunt Winona waited with food and water. While Eliza slept under Maeve's care, Kitchy spread the ledger on a flat stone and read by firelight. Nora sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The pages were damning years of theft, coercion, and murder disguised as legitimate business. But it was the list at the back that made Kitchy's breath stop. W. Eagle. Num 2 shaft. Cave-in. Disposed. Beneath Wombley's name was the notation Nora had seen: C. Freight Bill, 1873-0412. Silver shipment. Government contract. Priority disposal. Kitchy pulled out the receipt Maeve had given him and compared the dates. They matched. He rifled through the other documents from the safe and found a freight bill for a large silver shipment to the U.S. Army, dated April 12, 1873. The bill listed Grigg as the contractor and included a notation: native labor utilized. Costs minimal. Security maintained. Supervisor K. White Eagle. Kitchy's blood ran cold. He read the name again, his mind spinning. Supervisor K. White Eagle, his full name, his Lakota name, the one his mother had given him. Beneath the freight bill, he found another document, a labor contract dated 4 years prior, signed in his own hand. I, Kitchy White Eagle, agree to work as mine supervisor for Grigg's Silver No. 2 for a period of 6 months in exchange for payment of debts incurred to Trader J. Morrison. The words blurred. Kitchy sank to his knees, the paper shaking in his hands. Memories flooded back, memories he had buried, tried to forget. 4 years ago, desperate for money to pay off a debt to a crooked trader who had threatened to take his mother's land, he had taken work at Grigg's mine. He had supervised the native laborers, enforced the quotas, turned a blind eye to the conditions because he told himself it was temporary, told himself he would leave as soon as the debt was paid. And then Grigg had refused to release him, had burned the brand into his arm, had shackled him in the number 2 shaft alongside the men he had once supervised. He had escaped. But Wombly, coming to the mine months later to look for Kitchie, had been caught. And Grigg, recognizing the family name, had used Wombly as leverage, had worked him to death in the same shaft where Kitchie had been held. It was his fault. All of it. Nora appeared beside him. She saw the papers in his hands, saw the look on his face. "Kitchie, what is it?" He could not speak. He handed her the contract. She read it, her face paling. "You worked for Grigg," she whispered. "Yes." His voice was raw, broken. 4 years ago, I supervised the laborers. I enforced his rules. I turned men into slaves because I needed money, and I was a coward. He looked at her, his eyes red. And when I escaped, Wombly came looking for me. Grigg caught him, used him, killed him. Because of me. Nora stared at him. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she knelt beside him and took his hands. "It is not your fault," she said quietly but firmly. "Grigg is a monster. He trapped you the same way he trapped us. The same way he trapped Wombly. You did not kill your brother. Grigg did. I should have. You did everything you could." Her voice was firm, unyielding. "You escaped. You survived. And now you are going to make sure Grigg pays for what he did. That is all that matters. That is the only path forward." Kitchie looked at her, searching her face for disgust, for betrayal. But all he saw was understanding, and something else. Something that made his chest ache with a feeling he had not allowed himself in years. Trust. He nodded slowly. "We finish this. Together." "Together," Nora agreed. That night, Kitchie could not sleep. He lay on a buffalo robe near the fire, staring at the smoke hole, watching sparks spiral upward into the darkness. His mind kept returning to the mine, to the faces of the men he had supervised, to the sound of pickaxes striking stone 12 hours a day. He remembered their exhaustion, their hunger, the way they looked at him, with a mixture of resentment and resignation. He had told himself he was just following orders, that he had no choice. But that was a lie. There was always a choice. He had chosen survival over honor, and his brother had paid the price. A shadow moved near the fire. Nora sat down beside him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. She did not speak at first, just sat with him in the darkness, her presence a quiet comfort. Finally, she said, "When I was keeping Grigg's books, I used to tell myself that I was just recording numbers, that I was not responsible for what those numbers meant. But every time I wrote down a man's wage in scrip, every time I calculated fees that could never be repaid, I knew I was part of the machine. I knew I was helping Grigg steal from people." She paused. "I told myself I had no choice. But that was a lie too." Kitchie turned to look at her. "You were a prisoner. So were you. But we both made choices within those cages. And now we have a choice to make those choices mean something." She reached out and touched his hand. "You cannot undo the past. Neither can I. But we can make sure the future is different." Kitchie's fingers closed around hers. For a long time they sat like that, hands linked, two people bound by guilt and determination, and the fragile hope that redemption might still be possible. "My mother used to say that the river does not ask the stone for permission to wear it away," Kitchie said quietly. "It simply flows, day after day, year after year, until even the hardest stone becomes sand." He looked at Nora. "We are the river. Grigg is the stone, and we will not stop flowing until he is nothing but dust." Nora squeezed his hand. "Then let us begin." The next morning they rode to Maeve's cabin and found the doctor packing her instruments into a leather bag, her face pale, her hands unsteady. Sheriff Lyle and 2 deputies had come at dawn, she explained, and closed her clinic. They said she was harboring criminals. They gave her 24 hours to leave the territory or face arrest. "Where is Eliza?" Nora demanded, her voice breaking with panic. Maeve's eyes filled with tears. "They took her. She tried to fight. One of the deputies hit her with his rifle. She was bleeding. I tried to stop them, but..." Her voice cracked. "I am so sorry. They said Grigg wants her at the mine. He is calling it a trial. Sunset. He wants you to bring the ledger, or he will hang her." Nora sank into a chair, her body shaking. Kitchi knelt beside her. "We will get her back. I swear it." "How?" Nora's voice was raw with fear and rage. "Grigg has everything. The town, the sheriff, the mine. What do we have?" "We have the truth." Kitchi pulled the ledger from his pack and set it on the table. "And we have people who are tired of being afraid." A knock at the door made them all jump. Maeve opened it to find Ruth Caldwell standing on the threshold, a Henry rifle in her hands and a grim look on her face. "I heard what happened," Ruth said without preamble. "The whole town is talking. Grigg has your sister at the mine. He is calling it a trial, public spectacle at sunset. Judge Harrow will preside. It is all for show. He wants to make an example of her." "We have to stop him," Nora said, standing abruptly. "How?" Ruth asked. "He has a dozen men guarding the mine. Sheriff Lyle is there. You ride in, they will shoot you before you get within 100 yards of that platform." Kitchi's mind raced. He thought of the mine, the layout, the weak points, the tailing sluice, the powder shack, the hoist tower. He thought of Grigg's arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable. And then he thought of the receipt in his pocket, the letter, the ledger. He thought of the proof that could break Grigg if he could just get it in front of the right people. "We do not ride in," Kitchi said slowly, a plan forming. "We walk in, with the ledger. We force Grigg to face the truth in front of everyone." "And if that does not work," Ruth asked, "then we burn the mine to the ground." Kitchi's voice was hard, final. "One way or another, Grigg ends today." They left at mid-afternoon, the sun hammering down, turning the desert into a furnace. Dust rose in plumes behind them as they rode toward Red Bluff. The plateaus shimmered in the heat, unreal and distant. As they approached the mine, they saw the crowd gathered outside, 50 people, maybe more. Miners, merchants, families. A makeshift platform had been erected near the hoist tower, rough planks nailed together in haste. Josiah Grigg stood on the platform, dressed in a dark suit and a stovepipe hat, looking every inch the prosperous businessman. Beside him stood Sheriff Lyle, fat and sweating, and Judge Harrow, a thin man with a weasel face and nervous eyes. At the edge of the platform, hands bound, stood Eliza. Her face was bruised, her dress torn, but her eyes, when they found Nora's, were defiant. Boone Lasker stood guard at the base of the platform, his right hand wrapped in filthy bandages, his face still swollen from Kitchi's beating. When he saw Kitchi approaching through the crowd, his lips pulled back in a vicious smile. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the mine. The air smelled of sulfur and sweat and fear. Kitchi reined in on the edge of the crowd, dismounted, and helped Nora down. Ruth positioned herself on a low ridge with the Henry rifle providing cover. Maeve stayed with the horses, her revolver hidden in the folds of her skirt. Grigg began his speech, his voice booming across the assembled crowd. "Today we see justice served. These women came to our town as thieves and liars. They stole from my office. They attacked my men. And now they will pay the price the law demands." The crowd murmured, uncertain. Nora pushed through the bodies, elbowing her way to the front. She climbed onto the platform before anyone could stop her, holding the ledger high. "That is a lie," she shouted, her voice ringing clear and strong. Grigg turned, his face darkening. "Who dares?" "I dare," Nora's voice carried across the crowd. "This is Grigg's ledger. It contains proof of theft, murder, and forced labor. He has been stealing from the miners for years, paying them in scrip, and charging them for food, rent, and tools until they owe more than they can ever repay. He has imprisoned women and forced them to work without pay. And he has killed anyone who dared to stand up to him." She threw the ledger to the ground, open to the page with a list of names marked with black X's. A miner, a grizzled man with a scarred face, picked it up and began to read, his expression changing from confusion to shock to rage. He handed it to the man beside him. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire, voices rising, anger building. Grigg's hand moved to his coat where a pistol bulged beneath the fabric. Boone raised his rifle with his good hand, aiming at Nora. And then from the ridge, Ruth fired a single shot. The bullet struck the dirt at Boone's feet, sending up a spray of dust. He jumped back, swearing. At that moment, the powder shack exploded. The blast was deafening, a roar of fire and smoke that shook the ground and sent a column of flame shooting 50 feet into the air. The hoist tower groaned and swayed, timbers cracking under the stress. Debris rained down, splinters of wood, chunks of rock, burning embers. The crowd screamed and scattered, running for cover in all directions. Grigg staggered, thrown off balance by the blast. Sheriff Lyle dove off the platform and landed hard in the dirt, scrambling away on his hands and knees. Judge Harrow fled into the crowd coat, flapping behind him. Boone spun toward the powder shack, confusion and rage warring on his battered face. Kitchie emerged from the smoke rifle in hand, moving with deadly purpose. He sprinted toward the platform. Nora was already there, sawing at the ropes that bound Eliza's hands with a knife she had taken from Maeve. Eliza stumbled, fell into Nora's arms, sobbing with relief. They turned to run. Boone blocked their path, rifle raised despite his mangled hand. "Not so fast, you thieving." Kitchie fired. The bullet struck Boone's left shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped the rifle and fell to one knee, blood streaming down his arm. Kitchie ran past him, grabbed Eliza, and hauled her toward the edge of the platform. Behind them, Grigg drew a pistol and fired. The bullet whined past Nora's head, so close she felt the heat of it on her cheek. She screamed. Kitchie shoved her down his body, covering hers protectively, and returned fire. His bullet struck the timber post beside Grigg's head, sending splinters flying. Grigg ducked behind cover, cursing. The hoist tower groaned again, the structure tilting dangerously. One of the support beams, weakened by the explosion, cracked with a sound like a gunshot. Cables snapped, whipping through the air like steel serpents. The ore bucket swung wildly, crashing into the edge of the platform. Nora rolled clear splinters, tearing at her dress. Eliza crawled toward the edge, her bound hands making progress slow and clumsy. From the crowd, a miner suddenly charged toward Kitchie, knife in hand. Kitchie recognized him, a man named Cobb, one of Grigg's loyalists. Cobb had been in the crowd, pretending to read the ledger, waiting for his moment to strike. "Traitor." Cobb screamed, his face twisted with rage. "You sold us out to Grigg once before. You will not do it again." He lunged, knife flashing in the firelight. Kitchie sidestepped at the last moment, grabbed Cobb's wrist and twisted hard. Bones snapped with a wet crack. Cobb screamed and dropped the knife. Kitchie kicked him in the chest, sending him sprawling into the dirt, gasping for air. But the distraction cost him. Grigg emerged from cover, pistol raised, and fired point blank. The bullet caught Kitchie in the left side, just above the hip. He gasped, staggered, his vision blurring with pain. But he did not fall. Drawing on reserves of strength he did not know he possessed, he lunged forward, his knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. He slashed at Grigg's gun hand. Grigg screamed and dropped the pistol, blood pouring from a deep gash across his palm. Kitchi collapsed to one knee, his hand pressed to his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, hot and sticky. Nora ran to him, tears streaming down her face. "No, no, no. Get Eliza." Kitchi gasped, his voice weak. "Get her out. I am not leaving you. You have to." A gunshot echoed across the chaos. Everyone froze. Deputy Ethan Pike stood at the edge of the platform, rifle-raised badge glinting in the firelight. His face was hard, his voice steady and carrying authority. "Josiah Grigg, you are under arrest for murder fraud, forced labor, and conspiracy to defraud the federal government." Grigg laughed, a harsh, grating sound that carried a note of hysteria. You are arresting me. You have no authority here, boy. This is my town, my mine, my kingdom. Not anymore." Ethan advanced, rifle trained steadily on Grigg's chest. "And I have this." He pulled a document from his vest, a warrant signed by the territorial marshal authorizing Grigg's arrest on federal charges. "This warrant says otherwise. Drop your weapon, now." Grigg's good hand moved toward the fallen pistol. Ethan fired. The bullet struck the dirt an inch from Grigg's fingers, kicking up a spray of dust and gravel. "I will not ask again. The next bullet goes through your hand." Grigg froze. Slowly, with visible reluctance, he raised his hands in the air. Ethan turned to the crowd, which had begun to gather again, drawn by morbid curiosity, and the promise of justice finally served. "This man is a murderer and a thief. I have seen the evidence. I have read the ledger. Every name, every theft, every death. And I am taking him into custody. Anyone who stands with him stands against the law and against every decent person in this territory." The crowd murmured, the anger building like a physical force. Some of the miners stepped forward, their faces hard. One of them, the grizzled man who had been the first to read the ledger, picked it up from where it had fallen and held it high. "He stole our wages. He cheated us out of years of honest work." Another voice, a woman's, "He locked my daughter in that boarding house. Said she owed him money she never borrowed." Another, a younger man, "He killed my brother in the mine 3 years ago. Said it was an accident. But it was no accident. He worked him to death." The anger swelled, a tide rising. Grigg's face went pale, all his arrogance draining away. He backed toward the edge of the platform, his eyes darting for an escape route. Boone, blood-soaked and furious, lunged at Ethan from behind. Ethan, warned by some sixth sense, or perhaps the gasps of the crowd, sidestepped at the last instant and slammed the butt of his rifle into Boone's gut. Boone doubled over, wheezing. Ethan brought the rifle butt down on the back of his head. Boone crashed to the platform and lay still, unconscious or dead. No one could tell in the chaos. The hoist tower gave one final agonized groan. The structure tilted further, then began to collapse in earnest. Timbers snapped like matchsticks. Cables whipped through the air, slicing anything in their path. The tower crashed sideways, smashing into the tailing sluice. The impact ruptured the sluice wall, and gray sludge and water surged out in a toxic wave, eroding the supports beneath the platform. "Everyone off!" Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Now, the whole thing is coming down." Miners and townsfolk scrambled away from the collapsing structure, some helping the injured, others simply running for their lives. Kitchi, barely conscious, stumbled toward the edge of the platform. Nora grabbed him, supporting his weight with all her strength. Maeve appeared, her medical bag in hand, and took his other arm. Together, they hauled him off the platform just as it gave way, with a shriek of splintering wood and rusted iron collapsing into the surge of poisoned water below. Grigg, still standing on the edge, lost his footing as the platform tilted. He grabbed for a post, missed, and fell backward into the surge of tailings water. He went under immediately, came up coughing and sputtering, and was swept downstream toward the river. The current was brutal merciless. Boone, regaining consciousness just in time to see Grigg drowning, lunged after him, trying to pull him out. Whether from loyalty or desperation, no one could say. But the current was too strong. It grabbed them both, dragging them under. They resurfaced briefly, their screams cutting through the roar of water, then vanished beneath the gray sludge. When the water finally slowed and the dust began to settle, neither man resurfaced. The crowd stood in shocked silence, watching the poisoned water carry Grigg and Boone away toward the river and whatever judgment awaited them beyond. The mine burned behind them, flames licking the remains of the hoist tower timbers, collapsing in showers of sparks. It was the end of something old and corrupt, and perhaps the beginning of something new. Ethan arrested Cobb and the two remaining miners who had stood with Grigg, reading the charges aloud, aiding and abetting murder-assault conspiracy. The crowd listened in stunned silence. Then he turned to the townspeople, holding up the ledger, its pages now stained with mud and blood, but still legible. This is proof of what Josiah Grigg did. Theft, murder, forced labor. He lied to the government, stole from you, and killed anyone who stood in his way. His voice was steady, certain, carrying the weight of authority earned rather than assumed. But it ends today. The mine will be seized by the territorial government. Wages will be paid in cash, not scrip. Contracts will be fair and legal. And anyone who was harmed by Grigg will have their day in court. I give you my word on that. A cheer rose from the crowd, not loud, but real. It was the sound of relief, of anger, finally given voice, of hope, tentatively kindled after years of oppression. Maeve worked on Kitchy's wound, cleaning it with whiskey that made him hiss through clenched teeth, then stitching with practiced efficiency. The bullet had passed through cleanly missing bone and vital organs by what seemed like a miracle. He would live. But he would carry another scar, another reminder of the price of justice. As the sun set, turning the sky red and gold, Nora sat beside Kitchy and watched the mine burn. Flames consumed the hoist tower, the timbers collapsing in showers of sparks that rose into the darkening sky like fireflies. The tailing sluice had ruptured completely, spilling gray water across the ground in a widening pool. It was destruction, yes, but it was also cleansing. "We did it," Nora whispered, taking Kitchy's hand. "We stopped him." "We did." Kitchy agreed, his voice weak but steady. Together. Eliza sat on Nora's other side, her head resting on her sister's shoulder, exhaustion and relief warring on her young face. Around them, the people of Red Bluff began the slow work of picking up the pieces, of figuring out what came next. 3 weeks later, the territorial marshal arrived with a detachment of federal troops. He examined the ledger, the contracts, the receipts, and the bodies recovered from the river. Grigg and Boone drowned and battered beyond easy recognition. He interviewed Ethan, Maeve, Ruth, and the Calder sisters at length, taking detailed notes. And he declared the case closed, pending a full federal investigation into Grigg's dealings with the U.S. Army and the extent of his criminal enterprise. Cobb and the remaining conspirators were tried in a hastily convened territorial court, found guilty on all charges, and sentenced to 15 years, hard labor, in the territorial prison. Several other miners came forward with their own stories of abuse and theft, adding weight to the prosecution's case. The mine was placed under federal receivership, and a new manager was appointed, a fair man named Henderson, who had a reputation for honesty and who paid wages in coin, not scrip, and enforced safety standards that had been unheard of under Grigg's regime. The boarding house was converted, as Ruth had promised. The first floor became a schoolroom, bright and clean, with new desks and books donated by families across the territory. The second floor became a dormitory for women in need. No fees, no contracts, no locked doors. Just safety and a chance to start over. Ruth oversaw the work, personally hiring carpenters and teachers, turning a place of suffering into a place of hope. Nora managed the accounts, keeping meticulous records, ensuring every penny was spent honestly. Eliza studied under Maeve, learning to set bones, and mixed tinctures her natural compassion and quick mind-finding purpose in the healing arts. Kitchi returned to his people, though his recovery was slow and painful. He rebuilt his lodge stronger this time, with help from the younger men who looked up to him. He began to teach them the skills their fathers had forgotten: tracking, hunting, reading the land, the old ways of living with the seasons rather than against them. He spoke at the council fires, urging vigilance. The treaties were fragile things written on paper that could burn, signed by men who could die or be replaced. But for now, there was peace. Fragile, hard-won peace. And there was Nora. 6 weeks after Grigg's death, as autumn turned the cottonwoods to gold, and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter, Kitchi arrived at the converted boarding house with a gift. Nora was in the office, bent over a ledger, a different ledger this time, one that recorded hope instead of theft, when he knocked on the doorframe. She looked up, and her face broke into a smile that made Kitchi's chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with his healing wound. "You are walking better," she observed. "The bone remembers how to be strong," he said, stepping inside. He held out a leather pouch, worn but beautifully beaded with patterns of rivers and eagles. "For you." Nora took it, curious. She opened the pouch and found seeds inside corn, squash, beans. The three sisters, the crops that sustained life. She looked at him confused. "I do not have land to plant these." "You could." Kitchi's voice was quiet, uncertain, in a way that was unlike him. "There is a place by the river. The land where the old trading post used to stand. You remember Dr. Hollis said the woman who drowned used to walk there. Good soil, near my camp. You could build there. Grow food, teach, stay close." Nora's heart began to pound. "You are asking me to move?" "I am asking you to stay. Not just in Red Bluff, but with me." He took a breath, and she could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear of rejection. "I do not have much to offer, but I can build you a house. I can hunt for you and Eliza. I can keep you safe. And I can—" He faltered, searching for words. "I can try to be the kind of man you deserve. The man I should have been all along." Nora set the pouch down carefully and took his hands in hers. "You already are that man. You saved us. You gave us a future. You fought for justice, even when it cost you everything." Her voice broke slightly. "And now I want to share that future with you, if you will have me." Kitchi's face broke into a rare, genuine smile. He pulled her close, careful of his healing wound, and held her. Nora rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling the warmth of his body against hers. "I will build the house," he said into her hair, "and you will plant the seeds, and we will see what grows from the ashes." "Yes," Nora whispered. "We will see." Winter came hard and cold, but they endured it together. By the time spring arrived, Kitchi had built a small cabin near the river on the empty lot that had once held a trading post and had unknowingly held a secret. The cabin had log walls chinked with mud and clay, a stone chimney rising from a roof made of split shingles, and windows that faced east to catch the morning sun. It was simple, but solid, built to last. Nora and Eliza moved in, bringing their few possessions, clothes, books, the ledger they had kept as evidence and as a reminder. Maeve visited often, bringing herbs and laughter and news from the town. Ruth stopped by with students in tow, teaching them about the land and the history that had been written in blood and silver. Ethan came once, his new sheriff's badge gleaming, to thank Kitchi again for everything. "You changed this town." Ethan said, standing on the cabin's small porch, looking out over the river, where fish had begun to return in surprising numbers. No, Kitchi replied quietly. We all did. Together. One person cannot change a river's course, but many people working together can. In late spring, Nora planted the seeds Kitchi had given her. She worked the soil with her hands, Eliza beside her, both of them, learning the rhythm of the earth, the way it smelled after rain, the way seeds needed darkness before they could find light. Kitchi built a fence to keep out deer and rabbits, weaving willow branches into a barrier that was both functional and beautiful. One afternoon, as Nora knelt in the garden, her fingers brushed something hard, buried in the soil. She dug carefully, her heart beginning to race with an intuition she could not name, and uncovered a small metal box, rusted but intact. She carried it to Kitchi, her hands shaking. What is this? Kitchi pried the box open with his knife. Inside were old documents, land deeds, water rights, and a detailed map showing the original Lakota territory granted by treaty decades ago. The deeds were legal officials signed by government officials whose names Kitchi recognized from his time interpreting for the Army. They gave the Lakota rights to the entire river valley, fishing, hunting, farming, all protected by federal law. Where did these come from? Nora asked, though she thought she already knew. The woman. Kitchi said slowly, his voice filled with wonder and sorrow. The one who drowned. She buried them here. She kept them safe. Beneath the deeds at the bottom of the box was a final document, a letter written in a shaky hand, water-stained, but still legible. If you are reading this, then I am likely dead, and Grigg is either dead or in prison where he belongs. Good. He killed my husband in the mine 3 years ago and called it an accident. A cave-in, he said. But my husband told me the truth. Before he died in my arms, the supports were rotten ignored because fixing them would cost money. Grigg murdered him as surely as if he had pulled the trigger. He trapped me in that boarding house afterward, said I owed debts my husband had incurred. He made me keep his secrets, work his kitchen clean, his floors. But I kept one secret of my own. I copied his ledger. Every page. Every name. And I found these deeds in his safe one night, when he was too drunk to remember locking it properly. I knew he planned to destroy them, to erase the Lakota claim to this land, so he could expand his mine. I hid these documents where I knew they would be safe, in the empty lot by the river where I used to walk, when I needed to think, when I needed to remember that there was still beauty in the world. I buried them deep, where only someone who truly cared about this land would think to look. If you have found them, it means you are that person. Use them. Make sure the truth survives. Make sure my husband's death and my own mean something. A friend who ran out of time. Tears blurred Nora's vision. She showed the letter to Kitchi, her voice breaking as she read it aloud. When she finished, Kitchi folded the letter with reverence, his own eyes wet. She knew, he said quietly. She knew someone would come, someone who would care enough to dig in the soil to build a life here to honor what this land means. And we did. Nora said, her voice thick with emotion. Because of you. Because you never stopped fighting. Kitchi looked at her, and for the first time in years, the weight of grief lifted slightly from his shoulders. Because we never stopped fighting, he corrected gently. None of us. Not you. Not Ethan. Not Ruth or Maeve or Eliza. We all carried each other. They took the deeds to Ethan, who verified their authenticity with the territorial government and filed them with the federal court. The ruling came swiftly. The Lakota retained full legal rights to the river valley, including significant portions of the land that bordered what remained of the mine. Grigg's operations had violated those rights for years, The new mine management was required to pay substantial reparations to the affected families' money that would help rebuild homes, restock fishing grounds, and restore what had been stolen. But more than money, the ruling represented something deeper. It was acknowledgement, recognition, a legal precedent that could be used in other cases, in other territories, by other tribes fighting to hold on to what was theirs. That summer, the garden flourished in a way that seemed almost miraculous. Corn grew tall and straight stalks, thick with ears. Beans climbed the corn stalks in spiraling vines. Squash sprawled across the ground in a riot of green leaves and golden flowers. Nora and Kitchi harvested together, their hands dirty with honest soil, their hearts lighter than they had been in years. Eliza helped her feet strong and healed her smile bright and unguarded, her laughter ringing across the river valley like a bell calling people home. One evening, as the sun set over the plateaus and turned the river to liquid gold, Kitchi and Nora sat on the porch of the cabin they had built together. The river murmured in the distance, a sound that had become as familiar as breathing. Birds sang in the cottonwoods, not just the common sparrows, but orioles and tanager species that had been absent during Grigg's reign and were now returning to reclaim their home. The air smelled of sage and growing things and the promise of rain on the western horizon. "Do you miss Pennsylvania?" Kitchi asked his hand, finding hers in the gathering dusk. Nora thought for a moment, remembering the rolling hills and tight-knit valleys of her childhood, the farm where her grandmother had raised them. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, now a younger woman, who had not yet learned what she was capable of surviving. "No," she said finally. "This is home now. With you." "Good." Kitchi's fingers tightened around hers, rough calluses against her own work-hardened skin. "Because I intend to keep you here, if you will stay. You cannot keep me anywhere I do not want to be," Nora said, but she was smiling. "True?" He smiled back. "But I can give you reasons to stay." "You already have," Nora said softly. Then after a pause, "Will you teach me the old ways, the language? I want to understand the songs your aunt sings at the fire. I want to know the stories written in this land." Kitchi looked at her with something like wonder. "Yes, I will teach you. If you teach me to read the numbers the way you do, to see the patterns." "It is a deal," Nora said, and they shook hands solemnly like business partners before dissolving into quiet laughter. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge one by one, punching through the deepening blue of the sky. Around them, the land breathed and healed. The past was not forgotten, and the scars remained both on the land and on their bodies. The wounds were not erased, but they were healing, slowly, stubbornly, together. Eliza appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Are you two going to sit there all night, or are you going to help me with dinner? Maeve is coming over, and you know how she gets if the food is not ready when she arrives." Nora laughed, a sound bright and free, unburdened. She stood pulling Kitchi with her. They walked inside together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. Because they had each other. They had Eliza and Maeve and Ruth and Ethan. They had a community slowly learning to trust again, to hope again. And they had the river running clear for the first time in years, carrying fish and promise, and the possibility that redemption was not just a dream, but something you could build with your own two hands. That, in the end, was everything.